Yeah, I'm going to talk about factors affecting forage species composition, and nutrients is going to be one of them, but it's how the nutrients fit into the overall picture. And a lot of the information that I am going to be presenting here, you can find in our book, Cool Forages, which is available on farmwest.com if you don't already have a copy of it, although copies were sent to a lot of farmers in BC when it was first printed. You'll have probably 2/3 of the information in that book. So what I'm going to do is consider this kind of integrated approach to grassland management. So I've created this grassland pentagon, which is indicates that a grassland system, of course, is composed of plants, and the plant communities are usually dynamic and they're quite complex, and they interact with the animals. We heard a little bit about that already, and then the soil, which is typically not the best soil, and there's issues often with stones or slope or texture, compaction, and then there's the climate, which not only is subject to the same vagaries as all agriculture, but with grassland production, you also have the issue of winter kill and the perenniality of the crops. So it's really complicated. And putting it all together is what the farmer has to do. And that requires knowledge and requires culture and a lot of consideration of all the elements of the system and bringing it all together in trying to figure out how to manage such a complex and diverse system. So start talking about the nutrients, and this kind of might follow sort of from what Josh was saying, another way of looking at the same thing that he was saying. So here's a case, I mentioned phosphorus, but this really applies to all the nutrients. And so you have, in the soil, you have the organic component, which is in the organic matter fraction, you have the inorganic component, which is attached to minerals. And then you have a flow into and out of the plants in a way of root turnover into the plants by uptake, and different nutrients are taken up in different modes. And everything is quite dynamic, and the nutrients move from the inorganic to the organic, from the organic to the inorganic. And while in the middle of it, can you see the pointer? Yes? Okay, so in the middle of it is the pool of nutrients that are available to the plant. And when we take a soil sample, that's what we're sampling. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But it's a very dynamic system. So to understand the role of the nutrients, you really also have to understand the plants themselves. You can't do one without the other. So, but before I talk about the plants, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the dynamic nature of the soil. So this is some work that we did a few years ago with Tom Forage, who's now at Summerland. And what it is looking at the soil microbial food web after manure application. So what you can see is this top graph is bacteria. And as soon as you apply the manure, the bacteria composite, the bacteria goes up. It doesn't go up very much with fertilizer, but then it drops off. And at the same time, you've got protozoa, and protozoa are high and they go down. So why do the protozoa go down and why does the bacteria go down? Well, first of all, these protozoa, guess what they eat? They eat bacteria. So as soon as the bacteria are there, then protozoa are there. And then when the bacteria start to run out, well, then the protozoa decline. And so then you've got nematodes, and there are many different types of nematodes. Tom Forage is a world expert in nematodes, and you can look at them and you can tell them apart, which I can't. They all look the same to me. I can even tell they're a nematode. But amazingly, he was able to distinguish, and you can see that there are nematodes that specialize in eating bacteria. And so they're elevated after the manure application, but their life cycle is a lot longer. It takes them longer to reproduce, they live longer. So they don't have this kind of very dynamic increases and decreases. They stay around much longer. And then you have the fungi. and they're completely different. So the fungi are mostly mycorrhizae. There's other kinds, but the vast majority in the soil are mycorrhizae, and they form filaments. They usually last a long time in the soil, and they help the crop take up nutrients. And another thing that they do is they produce glomulin, which helps create the aggregates that are so important for the soil structure and the quality of the soil is so much mediated by the fungi. So they are actually not enhanced by manure and fertilizer. They do better without it. And so there's a totally different relationship, and everything is really quite dynamic. So the food web is not restricted to just microbes in the microbial scale. This is some other work that we did where we looked at invertebrates and arthropods. So these are carabid beetles. They are carnivorous, and they eat each other. They eat other beetles and other insects in the soil, and they also eat earthworms, and they move around a lot. So what we found was that as soon as we applied manure, or not as soon as, but after we applied manure, the plots where we applied manure over a period of time, the carabid beetle numbers increased. And the earthworm numbers increased, but the carabid beetles eat earthworms. So if it weren't for the carabid beetles, we'd have even more earthworms. So it's a very, very dynamic system, and it's very difficult to manage. And grassland managers are dealing with this, whether they are actually aware of each component or not. No one is aware of all the components, but these are some of the things that are going on. So this is kind of a fun picture. And I got this from Michael Roussel in the University of Minnesota. And what it shows is an alfalfa stand and smoke coming out of it. So what's going on here is they injected so this field, this alfalfa field, like many, are tile drained. And what they did was they went to where the tile drain opens up and they injected a bunch of smoke. And the smoke comes up where there are macropores in the soil. So these macropores are cracks, and they're also worm channels. So you can see where the bypass channels of water and nutrients are in this alfalfa field through this very fun experiment with smoke. So before I go further, I'm going to talk about how grasses grow, because we have to understand how grasses grow in order to understand what happens when we apply nutrients to them. So this is a remarkable thing about grass. This is a grass growing point, and it's unlike the growing point of any other plant that is not a grass. So almost all plants have what is called an apical meristem. Meristem is the growing point. Apex means that it's at the top of the plant. So most plants grow from the top. Why do they grow from the top? To get taller, because they're all kind of competing for sunlight or whatever. But with grasses, they live in a different world where grazing is co-evolved with grazing. And so the canopy is open. And the problem is really surviving grazing. If you have just an apical meristem, then you're very subject to grazing. And this is one of the problems with having legumes, because they have apical meristems. And that's why we call it grasslands and not legume lands. And so what happens here? So this is the growing point. This is magnified many times. And this is a leaf that's starting to form. And this is another leaf that's forming next. And they form from these ridges. And as the plant grows in the spring, you have more and more leaves, and the leaves elongate and they form sheaths and they grow out. And then something happens. All of a sudden, there's a trigger, and the trigger is day length. And the development of this growing point completely changes from this leaf formation to reproductive, and it becomes a reproductive structure. So the upper part here, instead of forming new leaves, forms the florets in the plant. And the area in between, just before this happens, the area in between these ridges elongates, and that becomes an internode, and that's what makes the plants taller, and they're probably taller so that they could disperse the seed better and also pollinate better. So as an outcome of this, you have a kind of an archetypal plant that looks like this. And this isn't an actual, no grass actually looks exactly like this. This is kind of an artist's creation. And you can see that it also shows the rhizomes, and I'll get back to that. So this is a rhizomatous grass that spreads through these rhizomes. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So these are the tillers that are formed typically, but they're not the only tillers. So it's the ones we notice, but there's another set of tillers that look like the one that at the picture here. And here you have leaves coming out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's just more and more leaves keep coming out. If you look at your grasses, you'll rarely see more than 4 leaves before you see the floret. And usually the bottom one is kind of not in good shape. It's already senesced. But here, look at this. All of them are green, and they keep forming more and more leaves. So at a quick look, you would say, well, we just have to wait a little longer and we'll get to florets. No, this will never form a floret. These are vegetative tillers. And a grass community is made of these kind of tillers and that kind of tiller. So this is what it looks like when you compare varieties that have more tendency towards a floral and a non-floral. So this is a variety called Signo, which is a big seed producer, as you can tell, and it's mostly floral tillers. And here's one called Rebound, and it has mostly the other type of tillers. So why is that important? Well, in the Signo, the floral tillers are about 75%. And in the Rebound, it's only 50%. So the non-floral tillers or the floral tillers in themselves, they're much the same in the two types of grasses. What's different is the proportion. So the non-floral tillers have about 80% leaves. The floral tillers have about, let's say, 30% leaves. So you can imagine non-floral tillers, about 80% is leaves, and the non-floral and the floral till is only 30%. Now you take the herbage as a whole, with the Rebound with way more of the non-floral tillers, then you have 60%, or you have 50% more leaves in the overall herbage from this variety that doesn't form as many of those floral tillers, and it translates into higher digestibility. So not only higher digestibility, you have lower lignin content, and you have, well, another indication of higher digestibility. And other things that happen is that the floral tillers, when it gets dry, they turn brown. They go through senescence very, very rapidly. So when your grass is droughted and you go out there and you look at it and you see all the leaves are turning brown, those are typically the floral tillers. But then the non-floral tillers, they don't turn brown. They just stay green. They have the stay green feature that is captured in corn varieties sometimes. So that's a peculiarity that now they don't seem to be as affected by drought. But there's another consideration between drought and non-drought, is that when you have a period of drought, what it does is it stops the formation of lignin. So sometimes the grasses that are subject to drought have less lignin, which makes them more digestible. So even though they look like crap, because they have all the senescence going on, they're actually more digestible. They won't have more protein though. They'll have less protein, because when the leaves turn brown, that nitrogen goes into the roots. So interesting, why don't these floral tillers, why don't they senesce? I mean, the non-floral tillers, they're usually associated with grasses that have other methods of reproduction. So with the floral tillers, they will form mainly on grasses where they need a lot of seed. But when the stand has been in a long time and already well established, there's no point in pouring more and more seed into it. What you want to do is you want to maintain the stand by having as much energy preserved in the tissue itself. And in any case, some of these grasses that form a lot of these non-floral tillers spread by rhizomes. So we see and we know that there are a lot of different grass communities, and the species are very dynamic. So one of the reasons the species are dynamic is the growth pattern. I already mentioned that there are sod-forming grasses, and typically they're smooth brome grass, quackgrass, very famous, of course, and Kentucky bluegrass is another one. And in contrast to that, you have bunch grasses that will not form rhizomes, and they'll tend to always stay in these bunches, crested wheatgrass, timothy, orchard grass. And then you have a bunch of grasses like tall fescue and meadow brome that are in between. They'll spread a little bit, but they won't form a complete sod. And they eventually will have spaces in between the plants. So one of the grasses that has migrated and invaded almost everywhere, right across Canada, right into the Arctic. We have it here in BC in the warmer areas. They're in alpine regions. They're on the prairies, and that is Kentucky bluegrass. It's not a native, but it's a highly invasive plant, and it's everywhere. So why is Kentucky bluegrass so successful in invading forage and grasslands? Well, there's a lot of reasons really, but two of them, I'll just mention two of them. And one is that the grass, Kentucky bluegrass, is remarkably drought resistant. And it's not because it has deep roots. It doesn't have deep roots, which makes it a lousy producer in the middle of the summer. But what it does have is these two rows of cells here. They're called bullet-form cells, and they're very susceptible to water loss. And when they lose water, the grass folds. It doesn't roll, it folds. Kentucky, some grasses roll, Kentucky folds, orchard grass folds, and then it folds like this, and the stomata are on the inside, the pores are on the inside, and it becomes extremely resistant to water loss. And when you look at the leaves, they almost look like spikes, and they don't look like Kentucky bluegrass. And sometimes it's mistakenly identified as creeping red fescue or other types of kind of more spiky grasses. So that's one adaptation that it has. Another one is remarkable cold tolerance. This was a study done in the University of Saskatchewan some years back. And you can see that of all the grasses tested, by far, you could say the most cold tolerant was Kentucky bluegrass. Minus 37 degrees was what they call lethal temperature, which is 50% of the plants die. Crested wheatgrass, a very tolerant grass, only 32. Smooth brome grass, only 28, and it's also quite hardy, and so is timothy. And other grasses like orchard grass and meadow brome have a lower lethal, or higher, I guess, lethal temperature. So why is all this important? So this is a relationship that we came about from our studies, and actually in Saskatchewan, where we looked at the relationship between the percentage of coarse grasses and yield. So we found very strongly across a whole lot of different pastures and hayfields that the higher percentage of coarse grasses, mainly smooth brome, also it could be crested wheatgrass in some cases, and it was also some quackgrass, but by far the majority was smooth brome grass. And the main fine grass, the alternative that was there, was Kentucky bluegrass, but sometimes creeping red fescue. So it's valuable to have more coarse grass for your yield. So what happens in a stand is that it's dynamic and the proportion of species change. And this is a study we did over a number of years, over a number of locations in Saskatchewan on pastures. And we applied different rates of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And I was glad that Josh had mentioned sulfur. And so what we find is that if you don't apply anything, no nitrogen, not phosphorus, then the legume component, which is mainly alfalfa, does pretty well, and you get a lot of weeds, which is not surprising. Forbs, fancy way to say weeds. And then you have like 50-50 mix of coarse and fine grasses. Now you add straight nitrogen and you knock back the legumes. I think that's, Josh had mentioned that already. And otherwise, and also the forbs, you have a little bit more grass, both in equal proportion. And this is sort of consistent with what Josh had mentioned. And now we add nitrogen and phosphorus, and what we get is a shift between the coarse grasses and the fine grasses. So the ratio goes from 1 to 1, coarse to fine. Now it's 1.5 to 1. And then if we add more nitrogen without phosphorus, then we're back to just 0.6. So there's an imbalance now, and the legume doesn't like that at all. And now we add more nitrogen but we maintain the phosphorus. And here we see that, again, we go back to where we were even with the lower nitrogen, except that the yield has gone up. We go from just over 3 tons to almost 4 tons per hectare. And then when we add sulfur, very nicely, we get an even higher kick in the coarse grass. Not actually a higher yield, but the coarse grasses done well, and the fine grasses have done not well. And the ratio, of course, to fine here is 3.3, as opposed to what we started with 1 and gone down to 0.6. So it's not just the rate of fertilizer, but the balance of fertilizer that can affect the composition. And of course, as I mentioned, it's very dynamic. So another thing to consider is the nutrient composition of these different components of the grassland. Some of this was already mentioned by Josh, and they did a nice job with that. So here's some other information. And what you can see is that calcium, where's my pointer? Calcium and magnesium, they're very high in the alfalfa and the dandelions, and the forbs to some extent. And then if you look at zinc, it's particularly high in the dandelion and the other forbs, and not as much in the cultivated species. And then you look at copper, and it's quite low in the grasses compared to what it is in the alfalfa and the dandelion. What's really interesting here is the molybdenum to copper ratio. So this is a bad thing. Like, to have a high molybdenum to copper, and that means the cows aren't getting enough copper. This isn't for the grass, this is for the animals. Okay, so they're not getting enough copper, and you will have to supplement copper, like copper sulfate in the dugouts or something like that. But what's interesting is that the ratio is very nice in the alfalfa, and it's just as good, if not better, in the weeds. So the weeds are actually favorable from the standpoint of the grass nutrition. So once again, you can look at some of the very interesting, very fascinating complexity of your system here. And that's what makes managing grassland so exciting and so interesting. So some more interesting ideas here. So we've seen that alfalfa declines over time, and but it depends on the varieties, and they vary quite a bit in terms of their persistence. So beaver is an old variety that's been around forever. I don't know if it's still around, but it was a main A type. It didn't do very well in mixtures, and it didn't do very well at all in pastures. The variety that was used for pastures and for pasture mixes was a Rambler, and others that were very closely related, like Rangelander, that were quite closely related to Rambler. There's one called Romer, even similar name. But then we did some work, and we discovered that these Rambler and beaver, they're actually crosses between 2 different species, kind of a purple flowered alfalfa and a yellow flowered alfalfa, which is Medicago falcata. If you look at the falcata themselves, we developed a variety called Yellowhead, and this variety is extremely robust. It doesn't diminish. It's very, very hardy under Saskatchewan conditions. It was proven very hardy also under Manitoba conditions and some places in Alberta. And I'm not sure about BC if it's really been tested. But what I wanted to show, okay, so here's what it looks like some 10 years after planting. And it's just about taken over. And you can see very clearly what it is. So it's yellow flowered. You don't expect alfalfa to have yellow. This is alfalfa. It's more vigorous in the spring. It doesn't grow back as well, which is a negative. So you don't get as good a second cut or a second grazing. However, when you're thinking about bloat, it's a little bit more bloat safe, because it's really the second cut that's going to give the cows bloat, because the alfalfa will be more lush and there'll be less grass there, because the grass really doesn't grow back as well as the alfalfa. The alfalfa will always grow back better than the grass. So in a way, it gives you kind of an advantage, but that's just a sideline. But now what happens to this community as a whole when the alfalfa shifts? Because the alfalfa will, unless you grow a very hardy variety like Yellowhead, it will decline. So what takes its place? So this is where we looked at what replaces. So this is brome grass at the start and brome grass at the end of the experiment after several years. And you can see that we start off with about the same amount, regardless of the kind of alfalfa that we had. And then after several years, we see that the brome is up, but the yellowhead, where the yellowhead was more persistent, the brome is down because the alfalfa has taken over its place. But what's perhaps more interesting is what's happened to the fine grasses, the bluegrass, which of course we know is not as high yielding. And what's happened is that at the start, you have only about 10%, and then afterwards you have about 35%. So what's picked up the void of the lost alfalfa was not the brome grass, but it was the fine grass, because it's very competitive, it resists grazing, it's more winter hardy, it's more drought resistant. It is just one tough little guy. So a few words about about nutrients. I won't say too much. Josh has done an excellent job. On phosphorus, we know that it's a very important nutrient, but it's also in Canada our most serious nutrient water pollutant. And some of the best work in the world and groundbreaking work on phosphorus as a pollutant was done in Canada University of Alberta and more recently in University of Manitoba. So I've shown you this picture before. What I've added on here is now we're adding inorganic amendments that go into this pool. In the organic amendments, if you're adding them like manure or compost, we go into this pool. And then of course you get all this going back and forth. So it's true that you can add the manure to the surface, and often we do that. The phosphorus is not very mobile, so it tends to be stuck in a layer near the surface. If the surface is dry, then the plants may have trouble getting some of that phosphorus. So incorporation is good when you can do it, but of course you can't always do it if you're not going to tear up a standard grass. But the thing I wanted to show you was this. So going back, when you take your soil sample, you're sampling this. It's a very dynamic quantity. And I think this is already mentioned by Josh very nicely. So another element to this is how do you interpret these results? So this is the Kelowna extract, and it was developed in BC, as the name suggests. And the reason it was used by the provincial lab was because it's an extract that you can use for multiple nutrients, and some of the other are more specialized. What this shows is a different relationship, I'll explain that in a sec, between soils in the lower Fraser Valley and soils in the interior. Different relationship. So if you get a Kelowna extract of a certain value here, that is not the same as what here. So what is on this axis is the water extractable phosphorus. This is an index of how the risk of pollution, okay? So so the higher the value of this water extractable phosphorus, the more risk of pollution that you have in terms of runoff and leaching. So for the same amount of soil phosphorus test, here, let's say 300 or 200, you have less tendency for pollution in the Fraser Valley than you do in the interior of BC. So the point here is not necessarily to dwell on this point, but just that it's so important to learn how to interpret those results. It's important to know what test is done. Not every lab does the Kelowna extract. There's Olsen, there's Mellick, depends if it's high pH, low pH cells, all kinds of factors, and they are not directly comparable. They're kind of indicative. But as Josh said, you need to relate that to crop growth because there isn't a single relationship, and that's where experience in understanding what these numbers actually mean on your farm, on your soil, on your crop, on your budget, and so on. So I was glad again that Josh mentioned sulfur, so I have to say too much, I won't. But sometimes you can see a sulfur deficiency. As you can see, the yellow patches in this field, picture taken in BC on alfalfa, are sandier areas that, because they're sandier, they're more prone to sulfur deficiency, and that's what it is. However, how are you going to know that that's not nitrogen? You can't. Looks the same because sulfur affects amino acids and nitrogen affects. Both sulfur and nitrogen, their main purpose is in amino acids. And so in the end, they're going to look the same. It's just that the quantity of sulfur you need is about 1/10 you need for nitrogen. So soils respond differently. There are soil tests. There is a soil test, as Josh mentioned, but they're not great for sulfur. There's problems. It's a problematic test. So you can see that here's in the interior area. This is work that Grant Kolenko did a number of years ago. And you can see that there are responsive sites and non-responsive sites, and there are years when they're responsive and not, and something along the same line in the coastal area where you have responsive sites and then you have negative non-responsive sites. So you need to know, and you can get an indication from the soil test, but it's not surefire. So here we put it all back together again. Here's our pentagon. And we know now that, and we've talked about the fact that we have often marginal soils that need help. We have plant communities that are dynamic and complex. We have animals that interact constantly with them unless it's a harvested situation. We have climate, which not only has to often deal with poor soils, but we also have to consider winter kill. And then somehow the manager has to put the story together. So the conclusion is as follows: the grassland production occurs all across BC, and of course it supports beef, dairy, and sheep. And the grassland farmers often need to contend with marginal soils, restless climate, and uncertain vegetation, while needing to produce consistent feed, which is more critical in livestock operation than it is a grain operation. So you have a good year and a bad year, it's what's left in the bank. It's okay, as long as you have some good years, but the farmer needs to maintain the cows. So consistency is another whole element that the grain farmer won't feel as strongly. And the grass farmer needs to manage all these multiple interactions that we talked about. Their tools, it's a personal mix. Everyone is different. It's observation, it's intuition, it's experience, and of course it's science. So moving forward, we need to consider that advances in grassland production involves improvements of plant, animal, and soil, and learning to adapt to an ever-changing climate. Farmers and ranchers need to use all local resources, whatever they can reach out to, which includes their neighbors, commercial suppliers, professional advisors, or literature, internet sites. And the grassland farmers need to carry out on-farm trials. So this is DIY. It's a world of DIY. We can't buy a couch without getting a box with sticks and cushions and a screwdriver. And I think it's a world of DIY for research too. There was a time when this service was provided by government. It isn't anymore, and the information needed cannot be anyway provided by one central source. So it's incumbent on farmers to really develop their own understanding. And this it can be done with relatively simple on-farm trials. And I think the BC Forage Council can help with that. Serena and I have been talking about different models for doing these tests. I won't get into that now. But this is the approach towards the future in terms of getting better knowledge and better technology out there, is the farmers with help from the community to develop their own understanding and to learn from one another as they do these on-farm. It could be as simple as a strip trial with different fertilizer rates. And the most important tool of the grassland farmer is really keen observation and the love of the land. And that's it. Thank you.